Okay, Andrew, I think it's time to have a little bit of a vocabulary lesson, and I've got a fun term for us today, and that is trauma bonding. Let's talk about it.
That's my favorite kind. That's my favorite kind of bonding.
Is it? Yeah.
Well, based on what I'm pretty sure that it means, because I watch a lot of TikToks, so.
Right. Yeah. Because trauma bonding is just two people bonding over their trauma, right?
Exactly. Isn't it? I mean, I thought, we're both sharing stories about the things that we've gone through, and that's trauma bonding.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Good. Case closed. Vocab lesson over. But actually, no, it's not that. Do you have a succinct kind of definition or way that you describe trauma bonding, Andrew?
So I do, because it does actually come up with some folks that I work with, I speak to. The way that I describe trauma bonding, and I don't know if this is the best way or the most succinct way, but is simply that trauma bonding is kind of when you... one metaphor I use, and I don't know if this is entirely accurate, but almost like Stockholm Syndrome, where the person that is abusing you actually kind of align yourself on that side to where you don't actually see it as the abuse and harm and manipulation that it is. And actually are sort of feeling compassion, empathy, whatever, for the abuser. So the trauma bond, the bond is actually kind of from victim to perpetrator, essentially, as opposed to, the popular definition, which is basically commiserating over shared trauma. That's fun, but that's not trauma bonding, I realize. But I know that a lot of folks say that, and that's what they mean when they say that. But that's usually how I describe it, or some variation of that. But I'm curious how would you articulate that?
Yeah, I have definitely used the term Stockholm Syndrome kind of synonymously or interchangeably with trauma bonding because, it's this idea that the person who is abusing you is also the person that you are looking to for love, support, care, nurture, things like that. And we see it pop up in parent-child relationships where maybe there is abuse that's happening, but then the child is also dependent on them for all of their basic needs and looking to them for safety and security and love. We see it in romantic relationships where maybe one partner is more of a perpetrator of abuse, but then they're also, loving sometimes and endearing and, a source of comfort and stability. And then I think we also see it in churches, whether that's with the institution of the church and the pastors or the, leaders of it. But also I think we can see it from God as well. When we have this very controlling, abusive version of God that many of us were taught about. And it's this idea that these people or this higher power in this place of, authority is harming us, but then also the one saying, but I love you, and this is love, and kind of conflating abuse and love one for the other. So it can create a lot of confusion in the mind of the victim or the person on the receiving end of that. Yeah,
as you're saying that I think that is a very good, very clear way to articulate that. It's it's a situation where both your needs you're seeking your needs being met by the same entity, whether it's a person or an institution, that is causing you harm. That is exploiting you in some way or another. And gosh, I mean, speaking about what that does to your mind, I mean, just imagine what that does to a nervous system. It's seeking safety while simultaneously being harmed. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I think it's so confusing because a lot of people, when I say confusing, it's confusing to the person on the receiving end of it. Because a lot of people, when they think about abusive relationships, if you've never experienced it, you're kind of well, why don't you just leave? How do you put up with stuff like that? And trauma bonding is part of it. There's a myriad of different factors that go into it and reasons why dynamics of power and control seriously shift the way that you see yourself in the world and relationships and your perpetrator. But trauma bonding is part of it. And in so many cases, that person literally doesn't have any other option but to stay with the perpetrator, like in the case of a child who's being abused by their parents. But then also when we think of it in romantic partnerships or even churches, there's a lot of different factors tied up into that relationship. Maybe it's you share children together. Maybe there's finances. Maybe you don't have the means to support yourself if you were to leave that, whether that's a relationship or with a church or, some sort of an institution where, you wouldn't have support outside of that. And I think that if people, if abusers were abusive all the time, it might be easy to actually leave that, right? If they started off day one being really cruel, it's like, yeah, then yes, you would see that and go, yeah, not for me. But that's not how abuse works. And so I think that's where some of the confusion comes in with trauma bonding, because there are good times. There's enjoyable times. There's times of connection and laughter. And then there's also this abuse and harm that's being done. And it's not one or the other. It's always mixed together. And that can feel very like crazy making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe this is, so I know this is a vocabulary lesson, we're not necessarily trying to unpack all the things, but I'm curious, once you start to recognize or suspect that you might be in a pattern like that, I wonder what would be someone's first step to what can you do about it? I know that's a big question, and maybe it's a better answered somewhere else at another time, but
the idea of denial comes to mind, not meaning to go into denial, but denial as a concept of like a defense mechanism that we use to keep us from seeing things how they truly are. Because if we did see them for how they truly are, it would feel consciously intolerable. And when we start to see things for how they truly are, it's like, oh, we can't unsee it, right? It's like, oh man. And the natural response to that often is anger, to feel a lot of anger because of what's been done to me, or maybe I've been sold this bill of goods, or I've been duped, right? And so I think letting yourself feel that is important. I think it shows your own value and importance when you can allow yourself to feel angry that this is not okay. This is happening and this is not okay. But then to also be careful, because when we're talking about abusive situations, whether that's, a relationship or within a system, you can't always fight back. You can't always just leave. And so if there's a way to get support that will help you develop a plan or a process as to how to disentangle yourself, I would very much encourage people to seek that out. And that could be, a therapist or a coach, but it also might be some free resources in the community, whether it's like a women's shelter or, something like that, where they might be able to provide some of that. Because when we disentangle from somebody who is abusive, there's always, it always kind of gets worse before it gets better, because when somebody's losing control, they oftentimes they inflate their behaviors in order to try to continue to have control over you. How do you, when you're working with clients and they're realizing this, is there anything that you have done that's been helpful, or things you've explained to them?
Well, honestly, what you just said is so incredibly important, is getting past that piece of denial, and anger does oftentimes come up. Anger, intense grief, just the feeling of loss, but a lot of it, sooner or later, anger, I think, is usually inevitable. Just a lot of us have been conditioned to, anger is not okay, so we avoid it at all costs. But I find that usually sooner or later that does come up. And I think most folks who know me already know that I am all about anger. So
yeah,
which you
I
said
love
that.
it.
And I'm really here for that. And then what I always tell people too, especially for those who don't know me or the nuance of what I'm saying, anger is not inherently violent. It's not inherently harmful or destructive. It's a feeling, and I actually like anger because usually there's usually a tremendous amount of wisdom in anger that recognizes harm or injustice for exactly what it is not rationalizing it away or bypassing it, but saying what needs to be said, even if just internally. From a mental health perspective, working with a client or doing that inner work, I think anger is I like it. I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, I love anger. So fun. Is there a term that you would use when somebody is wanting to refer to bonding over traumatic experiences or shared experiences that were maybe traumatic in nature?
I don't know if I have like a particular a one particular
Yeah.
term for that, but I mean, I definitely think, I will say, I do think there is a tremendous amount of value in having community with shared lived experiences. I'll say that. That I can't overstate. I mean, just in the past 4 years, you and I have seen, like, on social media, the absolute blossoming of this deconstruction community. And I mean, that's the function of, I see what is playing out there. It's like, that's what happened for me. It's like, I realized there's other people who've lived this thing I've lived. I'm not the only one. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so, but yeah, that's not trauma bonding. But I don't know if there's do you have a succinct term for that? I do think though that connection is so important though.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a term that exactly describes it. Like, something quippy like trauma bonding or bonding over trauma or whatever. I do like the term that I first heard from Brene Brown called common enemy intimacy, where we grow like a sense of an intimate, not necessarily physically intimate, but like a sense of connection, a sense of being known as a result of a common enemy. Which I actually think can be really powerful in a relationship. It really can be a bonding experience. And in some ways, like a really great, like starts to lay a nice foundation for a relationship. I think it's helpful to realize like we probably don't want to get caught in that, where like the only thing that we have in common is this common enemy or this common experience that we have. But I think that there really can be some huge benefit in that idea of common enemy intimacy, especially when we're aware that it's happening and then being intentional to look at like, how do we develop our relationships outside of that thing, make them bigger and stronger and deeper, a more full relationship than just that one thing. That's the only term that comes to mind that might fit. Otherwise, I would just say, yeah, like we have a similar experience as, what happened to us or whatever. But yeah, that's what I usually say.
Yeah, common enemy intimacy. I like that. Yeah, that's a good phrase.
Yeah, it might be just a little bit more accurate than trauma bonding. So, like, the more you know, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.